Cannabis. My name is Chris Parrington. I'm a partner with the Zuber Lawler Law Firm in the Minneapolis office, and I've been practicing law in the cannabis space for 9 years. But more importantly, I have the pleasure of moderating this panel discussion with some of the absolute leaders in the tribal cannabis industry across the country, and being able to not just moderate this panel, but learn, just like the rest of you, on all things tribal cannabis, specifically related to tribal sovereignty. We have an incredibly impressive panel of tribal cannabis leaders here with us today, and I want to start with some short introductions. But before that, need to make a disclaimer that the views expressed by the panelists in this webinar are the personal views of the panelists, and not necessarily the views of their respective companies, firms, or clients. The panelists' views should not be considered to provide any type of advice, including financial advice or legal advice. We also advise that cannabis is illegal under federal law. We can't take steps to help conceal federal law violations. Having said that, our first panelist is Seth Pearman. Seth is an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. He is a graduate of the University of South Dakota School of Law. He is an attorney. He is currently the Attorney General for the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe. He previously worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office in South Dakota. He is president of the South Dakota Indian Country Bar Association and chair of the State Bar of South Dakota's Indian Law Committee. Our second panelist is Joe Montoya. Joe is an enrolled member from the Big Valley Rancheria Band of Promo Indians. He is the CEO of Green Chief Farms, which is a Native American-owned cannabis company operating in the California tribal market and has been in operation since 2018. Joe is one of the first tribal members from the Big Valley Rancheria Band of Promo Indians to be fully licensed in the cannabis tribal market. Our third panelist is Lindsay Renner. Lindsay is an enrolled member of the Round Valley Indian Tribes of Northern California. She is owner of Native Humboldt Farms, which is a fully integrated cannabis company in the California recreational market. She is a 25-year advocate of the cannabis industry and has been cultivating cannabis for 15 years using natural and indigenous farming practices to grow craft cannabis. And she is also an instructor at Cookies University and has partnered with Cookies Enterprises on their Humboldt Grown initiative. Last but not least, our final panelist is Mary Jane Oatman. Mary Jane is an enrolled member of the Nez Perce tribe, executive director of the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association, founder of the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition, a publisher at THC Magazine, a member of the founding board for Just Us Foundation, president of the Idaho ACLU, a member of the board of the Association of Cannabis Health, Equity, and Medicine, served on the board of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, was the first director of Indian education for the state of Idaho, and most impressively, in 2009, was the youngest member appointed by President Barack Obama to serve on the National Advisory Council on Indian Education. So as you can see, we have an unbelievably impressive panel here and who have a lot of information to share on the topic of tribal sovereignty and cannabis. And I want to thank every one of our panel members for being part of this opportunity and helping educate myself and our audience on these topics. With that being said, let's just jump right into this. So we that work in the cannabis industry, but not necessarily tribal cannabis, we hear all the time about tribal cannabis. It's a very hot topic within the cannabis industry. Some of us speak on the topic as though we know what we're talking about, but I'll be brutally honest, I don't think we all actually know what tribal cannabis means. And so Joe, maybe if you could start off and just kind of give us a little bit of an understanding when we talk about tribal cannabis, what exactly we're talking about.
Sure. Thank you for that, Chris. The question, it's a great question. I think it varies from state to state. Tribal cannabis, for example, here in California, we're locked out of the market. You know, there's 6 tribes that operate, 6 tribal dispensaries that operate here in California. There's probably about 15 to 20 brands. And it's just different here. We kind of work together. And so we're not able to participate in the California market like some of the tribes in Nevada. And we see that they compacted there in Washington as well. So I think tribal cannabis kind of different, you know, from state to state. And it's just, it's a growing movement. It's a wave that is coming. We're seeing all these people here get into it, different tribes across the country. So I think it's one of those questions that tribal cannabis is just different from state to state.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that. So it's different from state to state. And then, like we have the states that have legalized recreational or medicinal cannabis, and that's kind of separate from tribal nations. So California, has their California rec market, and, tribal cannabis and kind of what we're talking about and what we're trying to figure out and, really try to structure and really wrap our heads around collectively, all of us, is kind of like that, the sovereign market that will be, yeah, it can either, compact with the states and kind of be part of the open rec market, or it can be like a sovereign cannabis market. So it's kind of, you have the open, cannabis market in the United States. And then what we will be talking a lot about is kind of this separate pathway that tribal nations can have.
So outside of tribal cannabis, one of the things that we do in kind of monitoring the growth and the expansion of cannabis in the United States is really tracking state by state what states have gone medical, what states have gone recreational, to kind of get an idea of how the industry is growing. How does that compare? What's the current state of tribal cannabis, kind of looking at it in that same context? How many tribes have accepted it? How does it compare to the state legalization market or the state industry? And I'll open this up to the entire panel. But what is the current state of tribal cannabis, and how does it look compared to state legalization?
I'll take a stab at that one from the perspective of the publishing world with THC Magazine. One of the proprietary features of that publication is a centerfold map where we're attempting to track every single tribally owned and operated dispensary. And that has been a lot of, fact finding with those nuances, the reality that, their tribal enterprises are the ones that are owning and operating these cannabis development corporations. And so, trying to determine which tribes are actually in cannabis is not always the easiest task. Many of them are not as flashy in their development. They want to, out of respect for their community members, as well as, for their diligence, just kind of keep it low key and try to navigate through the dark waters. But with THC Magazine, we've identified less than 50 tribal cannabis enterprises, a majority of them coming from out of the Pacific Northwest region. Washington tribes are really, heavy into the cannabis industry, with Washington State being one of the first legally recreational states. And so that's out of 574 federally recognized tribes. There's a lot of education, a lot of advocacy, and as we're witnessing, not a one size fits all model. So there's going to be a need for technical assistance and resources for those tribes that are wanting to pursue this. And I think that crosswalking them with successful tribes like what, Flandreau-Santee Sioux tribe has been doing, with Native Nations cannabis is really what we want, is that nation to nation network to try to eliminate the fluff that some of these tribes are paying for to enter into the cannabis industry, because there's a lot of risk involved and there's a slow process.
I'll jump in a little bit on that too. And I do think Mary Jane has the best list of tribes that are active in the industry by far in her magazine. It's challenging. I do a lot of lobbying at both the state and federal level. And when we're in, meeting with Senate Indian Affairs or something like that, they're like, well, we understand what you're doing, but what are all the other tribes doing? And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I don't represent all those other tribes. So it gets a little frustrating. But I think big picture wise, we're seeing a couple different models that are shaking out. There are some tribes like the Flandreau-Santee Sioux tribe in South Dakota. We have Native Nations Cannabis, which is a wholly owned limited liability company of the tribe. And what we're doing in Flandreau is we're self-regulating our own company. So we have a government side that does all the regulations. We operate in accordance with an ordinance and other SOPs and guidelines that the Marijuana Control Commission requires, our tribal Marijuana Control Commission. So we're self-regulating. And then you have other models like the St. Regis Mohawk, who've said not necessarily that they, the tribe, want to participate in the operations of cannabis, but they would rather create a environment in which tribal member entrepreneurs are able to get into the market and succeed there too. I would note also that when we talked about tribal cannabis, just because we're off res, it doesn't mean that it's not tribal cannabis anymore to me. So if you're a tribally owned company and you're seeking a state license in say New Jersey or something like that, that's still tribal cannabis because it's owned and operated by a tribe. We're just on somebody else's land and following their rules temporarily.
It sounds to me like when we're talking about tribal cannabis, we're really talking about two different things. One is tribes being in the business of operating in cannabis in a state regulated market, or two, tribes regulating their own industry for their own members, for their own operators. Is kind of a good way of looking at tribal cannabis. It sounds like when we're having that discussion, and probably important to distinguish between the two of them because they're very, very different.
Right. I like to say my tribe is a cannabis tribe, and under our ordinance, that's where Green Tree Farms was birthed and developed. Is our chairman put our ordinance in for the young entrepreneurs to take it to the next level, to be a fully vertical integrated supply chain. So that's exactly why we created Green Tree Farms for the day we can work with Seth, in South Dakota. We know that that's going to be coming, and that's exactly what this market is, the sovereign market. It's going to push and develop.
Mary Jane, let me ask you a question. So prohibition, the historical prohibition on cannabis, a lot of us, at least I could say personally, I've looked at the impact it's had and been able to see the impact it's had from a social equity perspective and otherwise on states. But what impact has prohibition on cannabis had on tribes and reservations?
Well, a majority of our federal Indian reservations are on federal lands. And so it's been, a really complex issue for tribes to determine, with cannabis still being federally illegal, how they move forward, specifically in states like I'm here in Idaho, where my grandma went to federal prison for cultivating cannabis in the 80s. And so the tribes in Idaho are very leery to move forward when the tribal state government relations are not amicable to the cannabis conversation quite yet. There's not a lot of political direction to move forward in a state like Idaho. And so it becomes a lot more complex for federal Indian lands in a state like Idaho, compared to, some of these other states where they have legalized recreationally and the tribes are, in parity with state license operations developing well-regulated cannabis programs. I think the biggest floodgate that was open was after the tribes received a lot more guidance and clarity under the Cole and Wilkinson memorandums. That was very helpful for tribes. They had the opportunity to see that they could move forward and develop. But there are a majority of the tribes still that are on federal Indian lands that we've been working with through the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association that, explicitly state that until it is federally legal, they don't see themselves participating in the cannabis marketplace, working on health equity programs, because it touches so much: federal Indian housing, federal health programs, federally funded health programs. And so they don't necessarily see where federally illicit cannabis fits into this big puzzle.
I can only imagine the challenges being in Idaho, Mary Jane. And after the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill, I had a client in Northern California that was in the hemp industry, and they asked me to help navigate the best way to avoid some law enforcement taking possession of their hemp product while transporting it to Idaho to a processing facility. And I literally sat with a map and drove different routes around and outside of Idaho to not cross the state of Idaho. So I could only imagine the challenge. Well, let me ask you this and ask the entire panel. Has the legalization of cannabis in various states, has that had an impact on tribal cannabis? And if so, how?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So, with the Cole Memorandum, it basically allows states to create their own ordinance, right? So each state, as long as they have like a very structured, safe ordinance, and there's a few key features in there, that they have to make sure that they're following. But as long as they have that ordinance in place, the federal government has said, okay, we're not going to intervene. And so in those states that have chosen to kind of, go forward with that and create those ordinances, it makes it easier for tribes in those states to then as well create their own ordinances. Because if you're in a state like Idaho and the state of Idaho hasn't created an ordinance, it's hard for tribes then to step out. But I think with tribal cannabis, we're really tribal nations are really following what the states are doing, so the state of California, they have a pretty active rec market. And right now they probably about 2 months ago released a memo to the DOJ, with kind of like the reasons why they think they should be able to do interstate commerce. So with California kind of leading that way, tribal nations in California can now say, okay, I mean, they're stepping out. Clearly, these are what they're stating as their reasons why they should. They're, going to the federal government and kind of pleading their case and creating their case. And so I think the states that have really moved forward with cannabis, it's a lot easier for tribal nations to come in and kind of follow their lead and feel a little bit more confident when dealing with the federal government, because yes, it's scary, and it's a whole process. But yeah, when the states have kind of led the way, I think that, tribal nations, can feel safer in kind of their movement in the cannabis industry.
I've got a really good example of exactly how it interplays with state legalization and tribal. So in 2015, we started our first operation. We have a fully developed grow operation. Flandreau has a relatively small land base, about 8,000 acres total. And what we had contemplated at that point was having a marijuana lounge. And there's still some videos out that are really funny to watch if you ever Google them. But basically, we were going to have people come in, consume small amounts of cannabis, 1 or 2 grams at a time, and then go home because they weren't able to legally possess marijuana off the reservation. So by initiative in the state of South Dakota, IM26, the state legalized medical marijuana, and in the actual ordinance itself, it provided for people to legally possess cannabis if they had a medical condition before all of the licenses and regulations and all that had been issued by the state. So we saw that as a huge opportunity and said, okay, fire the building back up. And basically, we started selling cannabis on July 1st, the date that went into effect, and had at least a 1 or 2 year advantage on the entire market. So we had in our system when we started, because people could buy and then leave, we would make our own cards. So we had our own tribal medical cards that they could come and purchase. When they left I think even right now we got close to 14,000 patients in our system. And actually we benefited from other jurisdictions around us having really terrible marijuana laws, including both Minnesota and Iowa. So people come from all over, and I think our state's catching up a bit. I think they've got maybe 7,500 patients, but just that situation allowed us to get back into the game and really establish what we were doing.
Another example of that is in Washington state, where they had that early legalization. There's 29 federally recognized tribes in that state. And I believe we're up to about 22 of them that are compacted, which again, because it was an early legalization state out of the gate, crafted that model, which seems to work for Washington state, but is definitely not something that we want as a best practice or model, because it doesn't work everywhere. It works for Washington state. They have a governor's office of Indian Affairs. Sometimes the governor's office doesn't jump until the tribes tell them how high. So it's a whole different, position in a state like Washington. And then in New York, night and day difference. Tribes are out there, well-regulated cannabis operations. They're doing it, and they're not waiting for permission from the state of New York to enter cannabis into the commodity trade commerce flow that has historically, since time immemorial been happening. As it's just another good that's not under the radar, I guess, is more what it is, because this cannabis commerce between tribes has been happening for a long time. Tribes are just now looking for, the guardrails to do it in a legitimate manner.
I wanted to say,
go ahead, Joe.
Tribes have survived on tribal commerce. Why would cannabis be any difference?
Let me ask that. And we have questions coming in, and I'll invite the audience to submit questions to us. If they're in line with the topics that we're talking about right now, we'll try to answer them as we go. If they are pertinent to something else, we'll try to get to them at the end. But a question that came in that actually is similar to a question I had is, do you find in your experience that tribes that want to get into this industry and regulate it themselves in states that have legalized, whether it's medical or recreational, do you find that they succeed? The path is more successful, the path is an easier route if they follow or model what the states have done from a regulatory perspective, or does it not really matter? And I'll open it up to the whole panel on that one.
I'll start with this one. I love this one. California, I think, when we're looking at it, it's a failed system. California as a state isn't able to regulate its system. There are more black market grows than legal grows in California. They can't enforce. Metric doesn't work. There's 10 spots in metric that you can invert or divert. And so, I think that what the states that have already, been operating, especially like Washington and California, and all states they're not doing great. When we look at it, no state system, no state structure right now is actually successful. And so what we can do going into this is look at those. Like Joe and I, we've taken the California regulations, it's 214 pages, went through line by line and extracted the things that are really important, the things that protect the liability of the tribe, the things that protect consumer safety, when you're getting those products out, all this stuff that the California Department of Public Health would want. And it's really only, 3 to 4 pages or something like that. So I think using the existing states models, but really looking at them and saying, okay, well, what's working and what's not working and why is it not working? And I do think, those states, like, we have an advantage with tribal cannabis right now. If we do want to try to create a sovereign market, we kind of have an advantage because we're able to look at these states, California, they're year 6 and it's not working. So we can say, okay, well, how can we make this better?
I wrote an article about 6 months ago on questioning or criticizing new states on their ability to somehow take the bad of previous states and expand on that and make it worse, and not take the good of previous states and improve on that. So it's good to see that the tribes are probably doing the opposite of what new states are doing, which is learning from the good, running away from the bad. So I appreciate to hear that. Let me move on to another question here for you. And Seth, I'll ask you this. Obviously, the topic of this webinar, this first series, is tribal sovereignty. What exactly is tribal sovereignty? What exactly does that mean for those of us that may not know, or those of us that think we know and are probably wrong?
Right. And it's a fantastic question. And it's one of those ones, like, you either know it or you don't. You're either sovereign or you're not. But so I was like, that's not a very good answer, though, if we're going to have a panel of folks listening to us. So I went and jumped into Black's Law Dictionary and wanted to see what Brian Garner thought. And his definition of supreme dominion, authority, or rule. And in my mind, it really comes down to the premise of you have the ability to pass laws and enforce them. You have your own area in which to do this. And I think that's very consistent with the federal policies that have been developed over the last couple hundred years of, tribal self-governance, self-determination. And it's enumerated in a few different ways. I mean, obviously, there are treaties that pre-exist most of the laws, including the Controlled Substance Act. If you guys want to write that down, that's sort of a get out of jail free type argument that you may need to make at some point. But early in the development of the United States, the Supreme Court kind of dealt with how do we really take a look at tribes? How are we going to interact with them? And if you go back to the Marshall Trilogy, the case that really stands out, and I think I cite pretty frequently when we do this, is Worcester versus Georgia. And basically, and I'll just read straight from the quote, it says, tribes are distinct communities in which the laws of the state can have no force, but with the assent of the tribe themselves or in conformity with treaties and with the acts of Congress. So if you take a look at, and I'm sure that's a question and it's been in South Dakota quite a bit, is, well, why do you think you can do this? I mean, I can't do this. I'm like, yeah, you're not a tribe. You're not your own government. It doesn't work that way. And we think of a second case that's a little closer to us in 1989, California versus 87, sorry, California versus Cabazon, which we kind of see as the nexus of Indian gaming and across Indian country. The Supreme Court again took a look at this and said, in that case, California was trying to shut down an operation for the Cabazon tribe. And basically, the Supreme Court came in and said, hey, only Congress gets to say how the state interacts with the tribe. And at that point, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act obviously hadn't been passed. So at that point, Congress hadn't said, here's what you can control state and Indian country. So the premise is they don't control anything unless Congress says that they can. And that's the same thing with marijuana, because Congress has not said that the state has any authority of cannabis in Indian country at all. So that's why we're doing exactly what we're contemplating now. And it could potentially even take a peek at some of the compacts that have been entered, and you could find those to be illegal. I mean, Congress didn't say that the state could interact with the tribes that way. So it could potentially void those compacts.
Wow.
So let me open it up to everybody then. Do you see a sovereign cannabis market really being a possibility in the future, or do you see the federal government intervening into tribal cannabis, similar to what we've seen with gaming and tobacco?
Yeah, I'd love to start on this one. And I love, Seth, that you mentioned the cases that you did. And yeah, it's tricky because, when Congress decides to get involved, it's under the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution. And, they have used that to enact the Indian Gaming Regulation Act and the PACT Act that regulates tobacco. And so the question would be, will they do the same thing to, intervene on tribal cannabis? I think that for me, when I was researching it, what I saw was that the tribes, they kind of wanted to cooperate. They almost felt like, it's best to kind of make sure that our interaction with state and government is good. And they almost compromised on the issue. I think with cannabis, we really have to have conversations like this, really unite. I mean, everyone. If there's 50 tribes in cannabis right now, I mean, we need to get to all of them. We clearly need way more than that to kind of start having this conversation, because I think it's important to, I think that we can have an argument. And if we all stand on the same platform and say, no, we're not going to compromise on this. Cannabis is good for our nation. It's going to help with other things. It's really a catalyst for, the regenerations of our nations, as a whole, and we're going to fight for our sovereignty on this one. I think we have an argument there, but it's going to take us all kind of getting there and really, first deciding if that's what we want, and I think that, for Joe and I have a consulting company called the Sovereign Agency. And so for us, what we try to do is we're not really looking at what's happening right now, like the short term, the immediate, right? So if people are compacting with the states, that might be good for them right now in the present moment. But what we're trying to do is predict what's going to happen 10 years from now, right? When federal legalization of cannabis either comes into play or it doesn't come into play. I'm in the open rec market. And so I'm also trying to predict that. And what we're seeing is that all the states are failing. Companies like BlackRock just acquired Trulieve in Florida. It seems like everything's going to fail. The federal government really only wants to deal with a few bigger companies. And if that's the case, tribal cannabis, we're still in our infancy. So we're not really going to be able to compete with BlackRock. We're not going to be able to compete in the federal market. So if we want our own and we want to, retain cannabis, this sacred plant medicine that we've had forever as our own, we have to fight for our sovereignty on this one. So it's a touchy one. I think that they may intervene. They did with gaming, they did with tobacco. But the question is, are we going to, really structure ourselves and unite and really fight for a sovereign cannabis market?
I think actually that the federal policy has changed significantly since both any gaming regulatory act, which is super paternalistic. I mean, we have to ask the state if we can do X, Y, and Z in compacting. It's hugely paternalistic. Take a look at federal liquor laws, same thing. You can regulate liquor up to what the state does. I mean, that type of activity is not being seen anymore. And we've actually really pushed hard to have parity with the states. We're sovereign governments. We should have the equal footing with the state or more in everything that we do. So we talked about the 2018 Farm Bill a little bit. If you look at that major piece of legislation that basically legalized hemp across the country, tribes were able to submit plans just like states. And actually, we submitted a plan. We're one of the first, I think, 6 states and tribes approved for it. So I think if we keep that mentality of, hey, we're not just this annoyance like, we have a tribe in our state. No, you have the tribe in your state. It's a government, and we need to be treated like that. And I do think that there are a lot of national organizations that have been very present in Indian country for the last 20, 50 years that are kind of dropping the ball on this, because tribes have to have the ability to regulate cannabis themselves, just like states. And you also have to think that if a tribe prohibits cannabis, they're regulating it still. They just said, we're not doing anything. And that also needs to be respected.
I think that's a great point, Seth, to bring up that even those tribes need to be a part of that ecosystem and that network. Even if they are adversarial to cannabis laws, that network is also how they're going to get those best practices to regulate, their Clean Water Act regulations to ban certain herbicides and pesticides that are known harmful to the environment and to people that are sometimes popping up in reservations where they think that we can just do whatever we want under tribal law because, tribes don't care. And that unfortunately is an attitude for some of the folks that are coming into tribal communities to do cannabis. But we also need to be mindful that, we were left out of the 2014 Farm Bill for those opportunities to protect agricultural sovereignty. And we have our brothers and sisters to the north who were left out of the Cannabis Act. So First Nations communities developed the red market because they were left out. That allows us the opportunity to develop a red market in anticipation of being left out, which we sometimes are. And at the federal level, tribes are, we have to be super vocal. We have to get more organized to be heard. We have some good friends and allies on the Hill, but many of the tribal cannabis conversations that need to be happening are happening in silos. We need to break down those silos. We need our like Lindsay was saying earlier, our tribes that are regulating now, a tribal regulators roundtable, so that those best practices and those policy priorities that are driven by the progressive cannabis tribes can, become white papers, so that we can back a lot of this policy work with the data from the tribes that are already operating. And that's what we're doing with the ICIA is trying to pull together that data, synthesize it into policy that's palatable for those tribes that are still fearful, we still need them all a part of the network, whether or not they are banning cannabis on their lands. They need to be networking with tribes on these laws as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on all of that. And I think that, right now we have the opportunity to take tribal cannabis and, make it better than what's existing, right? But that means we have to structure it correctly. Like we have to, incorporate those best practices. We have to be all meeting together and having these roundtables and saying, okay, what are best practices and how are we really going to make things better? And the thing is that in order for us to have an argument for a sovereign tribal cannabis market, and in order for us to kind of go up and have an argument with the federal government, we have to make sure that our entire operation is very sound, right? And there are issues right now, and everything's not completely structured. And that is why we're having these conversations and trying to get ahead of it. But if we want to have an argument and really fight for sovereignty and fight for this sovereign cannabis market, we have to make sure everything's perfect. It's going to be scrutinized, and we have to, maybe our testing regulations are higher than what the federal government is going to, have, or, just all of these things. We have to make sure that we're creating a better structure so that we can stand on the argument that we deserve to have our sovereignty and have this sovereign, cannabis market. And, someone the other day said sovereignty was not the absence of law, right? Because I think a lot of people do think that. They're like, okay, you can do anything, on a tribal nation, it's sovereign, but it's actually the right to govern ourselves, right? And so with that comes great responsibility. And now we have to actually get in there and do the work and, make the regulations really tight and kind of roll this out so we have the argument and we can fight for sovereignty.
So I want to move to the topic of compacts, but before we do that, Joe, I want to put you on the spot here. I'm curious, what are the pros of sovereignty with regard to cannabis? And more importantly, are there cons with sovereignty when it comes to cannabis? And if so, what are those? What are the negatives? And Joe, I'll, like I said, throw you on the spot here and get your 2 cents.
Sure, there's pros and cons with everything, especially with tribes and cannabis. I think the benefits are the economic development and the change that could come with tribes, with it being growing vegetables and food and gas. I'm from one of the tribes that's from one of the most here in California. We look to cannabis to help us. I think cannabis is going to help us open up a gas station within the next 2 years. So that's really kind of the development that needs to be happening in the Indian country. But it's like you say, with that comes the con, it comes the bad. We have to be able to govern ourselves. Sovereignty to me is my ordinance. That's what I stand behind. That's what I built my company on. That's why I'm out. Who I am is because of ordinance. We're able to govern ourselves under my ordinance. I'm able to get into this market. You know what I mean? So I really think that we have to keep that ordinance, and then we have to apply it. We really have to walk these lines. And here in California, my ordinance is mirrored after the 3 surrounding counties. Not only do I have to walk the line of the 3 counties around me, I have to walk the line with my own ordinance as well. So I really think that that's what the pros and cons are in Indian country with cannabis is really, are we going to bad actors to come in and persuade some of these tribes to get into these $1 million facilities that 2 years later are sitting empty in failure with no prosperous for the tribe. I think that's what me and Lindsay are really trying to do is focus and really help and benefit the economic development and really bring that in so it's a long-term project. We do have to look at tribal cannabis as 7 generations. We want to be able to leave something for our future tribal members to come in, something that they can be proud of, something that they can say, look at our tribe created this ordinance so we can do this and participate and be treated just like every other cannabis brand, I mean.
Anyone else have thoughts? Joe, I think that was just brilliant. I think you nailed it is what I was thinking. Anyone else have any thoughts on pros and cons there?
I have a quick comment that, everybody looks at the financials, they're like, oh, well, you only made X, Y, and Z last year. But you also have to think like, okay, we also employed 70 or 80 people who now have benefits, who now have, solid jobs in Flandreau. And I don't know if this is like this across the country, but we've really found there were some tribal members who, didn't really fit well in our casino resort setting. They didn't really want a job with the tribal government. So they came over to Native Nations Cannabis, and they're starting to grow. Be cultivators, trimmers. I mean, every one of those opportunities is advanceable too. So most of our managers are all tribal members now, and a lot of these folks who struggled with employment are now finding a career that they love coming to. They're working longer than we've even asked them to because they love it. They're so active, and it's really changed lives in that aspect too.
I have one to plug there as far as the pros and cons of tribal sovereignty in cannabis, where the rights of a tribe and this notion of tribal sovereignty sometimes infringes on the individual sovereignty of an individual. There are tribes in states where it's legally where they have recreational retail legal, but the tribe still opts out and bans cannabis. And so it's still a hindrance to employment. Their human resource manuals are still including THC in the battery of testing for pre-employment and random drug testing. People are still getting kicked out of their homes for cannabis in states where it is legal. So this is under tribal law and authority. And so those potential economic arm for a tribal entrepreneur is then cut off because of tribal sovereignty, because the tribe wants nothing to do with cannabis. They're still going to ban it on their reservation. And so, there's that double-edged sword to that. And that's also where I think that, there it is so complex because there's treaty tribes, there's executive order tribes, the whole nuances behind that tribal structure, and then the individuals that make up those tribes, because these governments are made up of our community members, they're our families, our people. And a majority of the Pacific Northwest treaty fishing case law, as well as a lot of the other Supreme Court precedents for transportation, is because one person made a bold decision and made a bold action, or resisted or fought back against the state in a treaty fishing rights case, or an entrepreneur doing interstate transportation for cigarettes, or taxation around fuel. So sometimes it takes bold action from individuals, and then tribes kind of come along on the fight. So there's that opportunity still, because this is uncharted territory for individuals to say, hey, tribes, you're stepping on my toe, you're causing me economic harm because I cannot move forward.
Yeah. So before we get to some of the questions, because we've got a lot of questions coming in, I want to make sure we answer. I do have one last topic I want to ask about. Lindsay, maybe I'll start with you. Well, where does the idea of compacts between tribes and states come into the equation here? What are your thoughts on that? Are we seeing that in certain states? How does that come into play in terms of tribal cannabis?
Yeah, so right now, certain states allow it and certain states don't. Washington does allow it, Nevada does allow it. California is kind of riding the line. They hadn't in the past, but take California, they haven't allowed it up until now, and they're in year 6. So if we, as California tribes, say, should we compact? Well, we've been locked out of the market for the last 5 years, so it doesn't really make sense. A pro of compacting would be, okay, you would have access to the 1,000 retailers, but the issue coming in so late is that there's no shelf space. So is it possible to get on the shelves? Absolutely, but most of the work has already been done. Everything's has been shaken out how it's going to be, and there's not really an opportunity for us in California. And it will vary from state to state, but take, Washington, it's working right now. And that's amazing. I think in the immediate, compacting can work for tribes. But, like Joe said, I just feel like we have to be looking down the line. We have to be looking at the bigger picture and, what can happen 5 to 10, 70 years from now, and in that, if that's the case, we have to look at what we think is going to happen on the federal open market. And depending on what we predict with that and what we think is going to happen, then, compacting is not really a good idea for the way it seems like things are kind of playing out right now, So, it could be working in some states. It could be a good idea. But as far as the bigger picture, I think really trying to nail down this argument and get everything just so solid for this sovereign tribal cannabis market that hopefully someday can kind of, can be, right there next to the federal open market.
Well, let's jump into some of the questions from the audience here. First question I have, for those of us with genetics and products that have patent protection, how do we ensure our contracts are enforceable and our IP protected when dealing with tribes? I'm not sure if any of you have any experience in terms of intellectual property dealings and protections when dealing with non-tribal businesses. If you do, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Seth. Go.
Oh, sure. So I think that when you're working with tribes or with any entity, you want to ensure that the contracts that you're drafting are enforceable. I mean, it's really easy to draft a limited waiver of sovereign immunity that the tribe would be comfortable with, potentially, so you could enforce by contract. Also, if you take a look at some of the cases that came out of, I can't remember what the medicine was, but the Supreme Court did some analysis on whether or not copyrights, trademarks, word marks apply to tribes in the St. Regis Mohawk area with, I can't remember, it was some sort of eye drop, but if you go down that line of cases, you'll see that generally the tribes are also have to deal with federal protections that are there for patents and intellectual property. Secondarily, I'd also note that maybe I lost my secondarily, so I'll disregard that part.
Lindsay, did you have something?
Oh, I was just going to say, and maybe Seth, can it's almost a question for Seth, I guess, but, in California, what we're kind of seeing is that everything's so new with cannabis, right? Tribal cannabis, open market cannabis, whatever. And so, there hasn't been a lot of cases that have been fought. So sometimes even if you have a contract and it's so sturdy, it's hard to kind of, take it to court and actually, make sure that it's upheld because everything's just so new. We're in the first few years of this industry, so it's difficult.
Joe, we got a question that might be good for you. They're asking about the ability of tribes to do cannabis deliveries within the state of California. Do you have any experience with cannabis delivery in California?
I've kind of heard about a tribe trying to do it, but I don't know. I don't think it's going to be possible with them making the delivery off the reservation. I'm not too sure how that would play out here in California. I know, I think the idea was pitched to our tribe to kind of do a delivery service because we have an ordinance, we have a cultivation, we have a dispensary. And, I think it was kind of shot down just because they didn't want to, the logistics of it. We just wanted to operate simple at that point. So I really don't see tribes operating into delivery services anytime soon. But I know there's one tribe here in California that did not want to get into the industry themselves. So what they did is kind of just purchase the dispensary off reservation. And I know they have a dispensary and a delivery service like that. But I think that's probably the only way we would see tribes do it here in California.
Wonderful. Next question, Mary Jane, you may know the answer to this one. If not, anybody can chime in, but asked, how does somebody locate prospective career opportunities with Indigenous enterprises in the cannabis space? Are there online resources? Are there recruiters? Are there ways that people that want to get into this space can get into this space as an employee?
Well, that's actually one of the resources that we're working on with the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association, is partnering with a job hub so that tribes can have that single source place to plug where they are working on recruiting for Indian preference and hiring in their cannabis facilities. There right now, I mean, prior to the ICIA network, I'm not aware of anywhere where you could go and specifically look for a tribal job. And I've seen a lot of tribal job postings on the mainstream hiring platforms out there, but that's what we're working is to close that loop so that it's that tribe to tribe network, so that, a trusted, vetted, reputable cultivator can move from one tribal community and then go to another and train in that community, not plant themselves in there for this, high paying job for the next they're actually just going in and mentoring community members and then going to other farms or coming in with supplemental technical assistance. But there's the other situation with that is a lot of tribes are also, in addition to tribal opportunities to work within tribal enterprises, tribes are putting their requests for proposals out onto the streets basically, and we're working on getting them streamlined to folks that are working in tribal cannabis.
The next question is an interesting one, and I get this a lot because I operate in newer markets, my own market, Minnesota, soon to pass legislation, but in other markets, which is, can somebody speak to the startup costs for a cannabis operation, and specifically, why does it cost so much? That's obviously a loaded question. We could probably spend an hour talking about that. But generally speaking, what are people that want, tribes that want to get into this space? What should they be thinking of in terms of startup costs and what's involved?
Start small. Don't overscale is what I suggest.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it really just depends on the consultant that you hire. I saw in the tab one of the questions about a project that's been in the media quite a bit lately with the Eastern Band of Cherokee initiative. And I mean, you can just Google that project, look at those numbers. I'm not going to throw them out there, but it's many, many, many millions of dollars, that is being requested for this development. And like Joe said, and then there's the starting small, the request for proposals that we're seeing, a lot of the costs that are associated with them are around economic feasibility, viability. So it's not just on operational costs. It's not just on lighting and infrastructure and building and develop and brick and mortar. There's a lot of data inputs that tribes are looking for prior to being able to build out. So the costs are across the board. I mean, completely across the board. I've seen successful startup farms that are tribally owned and operated cultivation sites where they started small, and then by year 5 they're gigantic, and they didn't invest the upwards of $40 to $50 million that you're seeing on some of these operational costs. I know due diligence is really where tribes need to be at with this next step forward in cannabis development. Because there's a lot of fast talkers out there.
Yes, there are.
I'd suggest not losing sight that this is still a business. There's a misconception across the entire United States that, I got a cannabis license, I'm a millionaire now. I've got it's smooth sailing, we're good to go. The true actuality of everything is that, especially non-tribal folks, a lot of the folks that just went in, got a dispensary, are on the verge of bankruptcy. I mean, there's 280E issues that come from the Internal Revenue Code where people can't deduct ordinary business expenses from their operations. Obviously, if we're tribes, we're not defined in Section 1 of the Internal Revenue Code. So we don't pay that at all. It doesn't matter to us. So there's something, and we did some analysis on a few different places. And, if we dropped our business, say in a certain county, we could be, with the federal, state, and local tax, 100% more profitable than a state-run industry just because we exist. I mean, it's that big of a difference. And do your due diligence, hire an economist to say, what does my market support? Do I need, we bought a 90,000 square foot building in South Dakota because we were anticipating the recreational market coming back and, being huge numbers. And it ended up, recreational didn't go through. So we sold it because we know if we built that out, we'd have way too much weed. I mean, it makes no sense, but anybody you can talk to will have, they should take a look at your area to determine how much you need, and then they should be able to give you a rough square footage estimate of what it would cost to do cultivation, veg, labs, which are the most expensive and hard to get equipment sometimes, and dispensary costs.
Yeah, and clearly, if you're
Go ahead,
in an
Lindsay.
area where you need lights or something like that, that's where a lot of, the costs are going to come into play. But I think that, if you have a consultant, coming at you with 10, 20, $30 million proposals, and it's going to cost this much, I would highly advise to, seek a second opinion. I think that, cannabis like I said, lights is where, it gets complicated, but as far as cannabis, sun-grown, light deprivation, etc., you can grow some really great cannabis without spending very much money, and I think that it's also, we need to be looking at what's already going on in the open market. Everyone did put millions of dollars in. Everyone did think it was going to go a certain way. With any new industry, it's going to be volatile. It's going to be unstable for a few years. So you really have to go slow and, grow. And then also, yeah, there's ways that you can make it so it's not so expensive to get started.
Next question we have, how do you envision the medical cannabis market within tribal markets? And the question, there's a comment that currently there are no tribes, for example, that have a DEA license. So we've talked generally about cannabis. We haven't really split it up, medical, recreational. How do you envision the medical market continuing to grow? Do you envision it growing, or do you see it maybe disappearing as more recreational markets come on board?
I think medical always, go ahead. Sorry, Mary.
I was just going to say, if I had my wish list, I would really have all tribes having some component of a medical cannabis program to meet the needs of their communities and their elders. The future after, and I mean, we're talking like this is not even happened, but since the Medical Cannabis, Research Act, that's opportunities for tribal colleges and universities to secure a position with research partners to lead. That's data is going to be key for the next 20 years. And that is really going to, I think, become more mature under the medicinal cannabis markets. And that's going to be connected to our Indian healthcare systems or our tribally operated healthcare systems. So the best practice for tribes is to maintain some sort of nuance with a medical cannabis program.
I think every jurisdiction has to have a medical component because there are always those kids that need cannabis. I mean, most states that are recreational are all adult use. And I know we've all heard terrible stories of kids, having terrible seizures or epileptic, events that are traumatizing to them. So I think if you're doing adult use, you also have to have medical. There's also opportunities to drop taxes from people who need it medically. And sometimes medical patients need to buy a lot more than just a recreational user because they're in, have so much more pain. So I think they have to integrate together.
What are some of the ancillary services or ancillary products that tribes need to succeed in this space? Obviously, I do a lot of work with financial services. Representing banks that are looking at getting into the space. Banking and cannabis is generally considered one of the more significant issues in terms of ancillary services. But in your experience, what are some of the ancillary services that tribes need to really help get up and running and get their industry moving forward?
Yeah, I think that the two top ones are lawyers, clearly, to figure this all out. And then accountants, accounting is huge. I mean, you have to make sure that it's feasible, it's viable, you're cutting costs where you need to cut costs. You have to have everything in line. If you do want to get investment, it's really important that you have a clear picture of your operations and, where the money's going. And so, yeah, I'd say accountants are huge and lawyers for sure.
Security, IT, packaging, construction, architects, any of the things that we need on a day-to-day basis, I would love to source those from tribally owned companies.
Wonderful. Well, we've got a couple minutes here, so I want to give each of you 30 seconds to give kind of your final thoughts. And what I would ask you is, starting with you, Joe, what's one takeaway that the audience should walk away from with, whether it's how to get into the space, what to do in the space, ways to have tribal cannabis continue to grow. What's one takeaway you want the audience to come from this presentation with?
Maybe just to support us and to know that we exist, that we're here. Some of us are locked out of the market. Some of us are able to compete. Some of us are, doing things like the tribe in, is it North Carolina? That's the only one there, So it's just really our messages here and us connecting as dots. I encourage us to work together. I really support the sovereign, this market. So I just really think that we should all really come together and have a place for us to talk and do these webinars and get our message out there. That's really what it is. And if you're in California, stop at one of our tribal dispensaries and some of our flowers here in the California market. Native Humboldt is a great product. But yeah, that's
Beautiful.
just
Seth, how about you?
I'd say don't be scared. I mean, if you want to get into cannabis, you have to have a very, very confident legal position. You have to stand by it. I mean, the biggest thing that you want to do in this whole thing is make sure that you're not an enforcement priority for the federal government and the U.S. Attorney's Office. Have those conversations. It's not worth hiding anything you're doing, because what you're doing is using best practices to grow cannabis for people who need it. And if you rest on those premises and you have your testing and everything else, and you offer a safe product, what are they going to say to you? I mean, the state's not going to interfere because they know you're solid. So I recommend doing very robust ordinances and regulations and following them. So that's the second part.
Lindsay?
Yeah,
Oh.
I'd just like
Yep.
to say thank you to everyone that listened. It's such a big deal, tribal cannabis, and it's whatever we decide to do and however this rolls out, it will affect the rest of cannabis in the United States as well. So we appreciate everyone listening and kind of being involved.
And last but definitely not least, Mary Jane.
Take the time to check out the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association. We are celebrating our 1-year anniversary, robust network of all of the ancillary services, as well as the B2B network in tribal cannabis, as well as our allies. It's really important that we have strong allies to help us grow and build this. And I think that as Joe was mentioning, the inclusivity of Indigenous perspectives in cannabis is something that the mainstream cannabis communities can embrace, for that ethos of we all move forward doing better for Mother Earth.
Well, thank you to everybody. Thank you to the panelists for this wonderful discussion. Thank you to the audience. For those of you that had questions that we were not able to get to, feel free to reach out to me and I can try to get those answers for you as well, or if you're looking for introductions. Also, please keep on the watch for the announcement for the next webinar in this series of Cultivating Cannabis, Tribal Cannabis. And with that, we appreciate everybody's time and